Hi, everyone. Phil Travis here, EOU, History 448, Modern Russia. Brief presentation this week on the rise of Stalin to the position of dictatorship within Russia. So, Stalin really begins his kind of move to the fore in the Soviet Union with his first 5-year plan, which runs from 1928 to 1932. This was a break from Lenin's NEP, his new economic policy. The new economic policy had been based on effectively kind of a limited, uniquely Soviet style of capitalism. And Stalin very much believed that that the country should turn towards a planned economic approach. And the first 5-year plan was based on a turn inward for the Soviet Union. So Stalin at this time is not interested in promoting world revolution. Stalin is not interested at this time in promoting the socialism of Europe. And in fact, his opponents, like Trotsky, for example, had largely perceived him as negating the mission of communism, the mission to expand communism and, in their view, improve the plight of people elsewhere in capitalist Europe. And of course, Trotsky and Bukharin were moving against this, and of course, it will come at both of their ultimate fates to move away from this. But Stalin believed that the Soviet Union needed to industrialize and it needed to modernize, and that the way this would be done would be through a planning at the top, and particularly from ideas pushed through by Stalin himself that were, to a large extent, ideas that that in a way he was developing on the fly. And so Stalin will turn the country inward. He'll break away from the capitalist aspects of the NEP, and he will force a mass collectivization in the countryside. And he will use this collectivization to create cheap labor as towns and villages suffer from difficulties with agricultural produce. Cheap labor floods the cities, or peasants flood the city and become cheap labor. And agricultural seizures would drive the development of this planned industrialization. So the first step was to collectivize agriculture. Collectivization of agriculture meant that you created these large government-planned agricultural estates in which individuals who own land and individuals who profited from land would have that taken from them. And instead, the state would collectively organize these agricultural farms, and they would determine where the agricultural produce went. And what this means for Stalin is really that most of the agricultural produce doesn't go to the people in the countryside who are growing it. Instead, people get ration cards, and depending on who you are and where you're at depends on the kind of ration you get. And so the government was effectively seizing produce, particularly grain, your so-called cereal produce, and they were taking this to go to the cities to serve the interests of feeding the rising planned industrial working class. And of course, many of these individuals were effectively refugees. So this is a planned economy. This was an attempt to end the hybrid capitalism, if you will, of the NEP, to collectivize agriculture and to use agriculture as a tribute, as a sort of tax that would then go to fuel the forced or planned industrialization that Stalin would undertake within the cities. Stalin believed that industrialization was the fundamental step to making Russia a legitimate modern world power. And it was in his 5-year plan that he would try to force Russia in this direction. The results of the first 5-year plan were devastating. Massive starvation in the countryside, and in the 30s, there's also a serious famine that exacerbates the problems that were already present there. The countryside was supposed to be used as a tribute by Stalin for the industrialization, and groups like the so-called kulaks, and the kulaks were effectively, kulak is a term that refers to a prosperous peasant. You see pictured here 4 kulaks. Kulaks were peasants that were landowners and who profited from their land ownership. They grew grain, for example, and they sold it at a profit. Groups like the kulaks were really purged by Stalin very early on in what was called dekulakization. They would have their land seized, and in exchange for the seizure of their land, the land was incorporated into these large government-run agricultural estates. Kulaks were oftentimes killed. If they weren't killed in the seizure of their land, they might be deported, arrested, and or sent to forced labor camps in places like Siberia. So Stalin really motivated much of his 5-year plan on the basis of forced collectivization of these land-owning peasant populations known as the kulaks. And again, this comes at great consequence in Russia. There are cases of massive starvation throughout Russia and in the Ukraine, throughout the Soviet Empire. Many people are repressed in these land seizures. Many immigrants flood to the urban areas where they become, fodder for incredibly cheap wage industrialization. That low-wage industrial labor was seen as fundamentally inherent for Stalin in making the Soviet Union a modern nation. Following the 5-year plan, of course, there's increasing disagreements and instability, and these lead to numerous assassinations, and these assassinations Stalin will capitalize on and use the actions to position himself in the status of dictator. And when we think about this, the significance of that is that what Stalin is doing is Stalin is moving himself above the position of the Politburo, above the organizational apparatus of the party. So even though this was not a democracy before Stalin becomes a dictator, it was still it was certainly a one-party state, but it was still a state that had a kind of legislative body, if you will, albeit it wasn't based on representative democracy or anything, but there was a body of individuals who argued and discussed and made decisions about the proper future course of policy. Well, following the 5-year plan, Stalin, particularly in 1937 and 38, Stalin unleashed a organized campaign of terror, and a campaign of terror that really is almost beyond our comprehension. This first terror, this first purge, wasn't aimed at just capitalists. It wasn't aimed at just kulaks. It wasn't aimed at just critics. It was aimed by Stalin at purging members of the party. In a lot of senses, the Great Terror or the Great Purge was used as a tool of creating a fear within the populace. And then Stalin used that fear to posture himself as the only person that people could kind of grant unyielding authority to, even though he was a product of this. And so he capitalizes on instability, creates a terror, basically a domestic terror conflict, and then uses the instability created by that to further position himself in a position of supreme leader in the country, as the only answer to pulling together the incredible instability that, to a large degree, he himself was the product. So following the 5-year plan, Stalin capitalized again on assassinations and killings, some of which, it's theorized that Stalin had a hand in, that he purposely manipulated some of these killings in order to, again, sow instability and use the instability to position himself as a supreme head above the party. Stalin, effectively disbands the Politburo, and instead he meets with the advisors that he thinks mattered to him the most, or the most useful to him. He facilitates the position of the NKVD, a secret police organization that was deeply fearful of Stalin, but also very vigilant in carrying out brutal terrorism. Torture becomes a commonplace component of this domestic state police apparatus. And Beria ultimately will move to the position of Stalin's primary head of this secret police organization that will be known for just brutal beatings and killings and executions and torture. In addition to this, of course, deportations, forced labor. This is why this is very different than other types of mass terror, because oftentimes mass terror is directed at a particular villain, a particular aspect of a society that is somehow being villainized unjustly. Stalin's terror was directed at almost everybody. In some cases, it was directed at his political opponents who were within the political apparatus. I mean, of course, Trotsky was run out of the country, and he was in Mexico, basically in exile, and he was murdered there by an agent of Stalin, killed with an ice pick to the head in 1940. Many of the kind of top figures in the Communist Party apparatus as it developed in the 1920s and 30s are assassinated, or they're arrested and executed for various reasons of suspicion. And so this is more than just a terror against a particular group, like the kulaks, for example. This is a terror that is a purge of the party. It's a purge of the military apparatus. It's a purge of economic planners. It's an action by Stalin that is purposefully inserting a deep fear within the organizations of the Soviet state. And through that fear, as Stalin's able to kind of distance himself from direct complicity, Stalin is able to capitalize on that instability and help himself rise above the party by kind of showing himself as the one leader that somehow people could turn to in this incredible instability. This, there was great folly, even though Stalin certainly is using this because, one, Stalin's extremely suspicious and paranoid about attempts to rival him for power. He's very much a megalomaniac. He's very much obsessed with his rise to power. But also, Stalin was doing this to facilitate his rise to power. But Stalin was very short-sighted in a lot of this stuff too. I mean, obviously, there's over 1 million people that suffer in this first purge. But Stalin these are some pretty significant blunders, as Stalin had basically his high officer corps in his military killed off right at the time, literally moments before the Nazis were going to invade Poland and ultimately threaten, the Soviet state, and ultimately invade the Soviet Union in the early 1940s. So he actually took out some of his best military commanders, some of his best economic planners were taken out in these purges. And so in a lot of ways, it hurt the organization of the state even further. But again, it was, I think in a lot of respects, it was the creation of an atmosphere of fear, the creation of an atmosphere of instability that Stalin could then use his own kind of cult of personality to reform and crystallize around his own leadership. And hence this picture here where you see Stalin lifted up as an almost religious figure within a Soviet state in which he himself had surmounted the party apparatus. I want to make one last point. The question is, okay, to what degree was the terror of Stalin related to Leninism? And Service talks a little bit about this. And, Stalin's terror was certainly based on ideas that were put forth by Lenin. Lenin had advocated violence. He had advocated terror. Lenin had advocated an authoritarian state, and Lenin had advocated a one-party system. Now, Lenin also had, on his dying bed, wished that Stalin would not rise to power. He certainly sided with Trotsky in the end. And likewise, it's pretty clear that Lenin would not have endorsed the types of behavior that Stalin engaged in the Great Terror. The idea of purging the party itself and the population thoroughly. Nikita Khrushchev later testified that during these purges, everybody in the country knew somebody who just disappeared. And maybe these would be in meat or vegetable vans that would pose as a domestic vehicle, but were actually taking people to, an execution site. But Stalin's act of massively purging the party and the population was unique. It was on a scale that Lenin could have never fathomed, and it was really down to Stalin's own personality and his obsession with his rise to total power. So the Great Terror certainly was built on an apparatus that was put in place before Stalin's rise. But the Great Terror was uniquely linked to Stalin's own personality and his own ambitions for power. And individuals like Beria, who you see in the end of the chapter 11, Beria becomes Stalin's head of the NKVD, the head of the secret police. Individuals like Beria were these kind of brutal officers of torture that used that as a way to get closer to Stalin and to themselves rise in power. So Stalin kind of creates this apparatus where people use brutality, suspicion, and so forth to support Stalin and to themselves try to rise in power. And most of these people oftentimes end up being suspected by Stalin himself, and oftentimes committing suicide or being assassinated or being tried and executed or being tried and sent to Siberia. Even Nikita Khrushchev, who you'll read about in coming weeks, Nikita Khrushchev, the future premier of the Soviet Union, who took over after the Soviet Union, was sent to a gulag by Stalin. So Stalin's purges really were aimed at everyone. And many people that were executed, strange things about this is that many of the people that were executed went to their executions, pleading loyalty to Stalin. And so it was a thorough purge of the population and the party, with the attempt of creating a sort of terrorized, fearful and destabilized country that Stalin could then use through, his position in the state to assert himself as the only real answer to the problem. So Stalinism is definitely, or Stalin's terror, I should say, is definitely unique from anything that Lenin or Trotsky or any of the other leaders that we've been reading about would have prescribed. And instead, Stalin's terror becomes very unique to Stalin, and it encourages others to use this type of behavior to rise into power, though it was an apparatus that was put in place by Lenin. So I hope this is helpful, guys, and sorry it came out on Tuesday, but hopefully this is helpful for you guys, and hopefully we continue to have a great week.